Alright, this is like the practice video. I'll be reviewing Salad Days, a song that I transposed myself. First I'm going to sing it in talkadimi syllables just to get it down, you know. Then maybe I'll play it over the talkadimi syllables just to make sure I can do them both. We'll see. D, D, ta, D, ta, ta, D, D, ta, D, ta, D, 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 ta, D, 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 ta, D, ta, D, 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 ta, ta, D, 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 ta, ta, D, 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 ta, ta, D, 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 ta, 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 D, D, ta, D, ta, D, 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 ta, D, 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 ta, D, ta, D, 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 ta, ta, D, 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 ta, ta, D, 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 ta, ta, D, 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 ta, D, ta, ta, D, 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 ta, and it just repeats. So, okay, so as you could tell, the melody is a little bit weird. It starts a lot on like the upbeat of the previous measure. So like, instead of starting on like ta of 1, it starts on like the D of the the 4th beat from before it. So I'm gonna just play the chords and sing the melody still with talkadimi syllables, just to really try and like nail it. Okay, here we go. Alright, here we go. Dee dee ta dee ta ta dee dee ta dee ta dee 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 ta dee 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 ta dee ta dee 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 ta ta dee 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 ta ta dee 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 ta ta dee 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 ta dee ta ta dee dee ta dee ta dee 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 ta dee 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 ta dee ta dee 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 ta ta dee 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 ta ta dee 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 ta ta dee ta dee dee ta ta dee ta ta dee ta dee ta dee ta dee ta dee ta Alright, now I'm just going to play the melody with the talkadimi syllables to make sure I have that down, and I think I'm good to go. Dee dee ta ta dee, dee dee ta dee ta ta dee dee ta dee ta dee 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 ta dee 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 ta dee ta dee 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 ta ta dee 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 ta ta dee 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 ta ta dee 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 ta dee ta ta dee 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 ta. That's basically it.